Welcome back to Reynolds Runabouts, everyone. I am Jeffrey Reynolds. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about how I reapplied epoxy to the interior parts of the boat. Now, the interior parts are the pieces that I was able to remove other than the seats. That included the two floor panels that include or are used for the gas tank and the battery to sit on in the aft end of the boat. And then the shifter, there's a couple pieces of plywood made out of mahogany that were used to house the shifter, which runs down the middle of the inner keel, which is really cool. And then the glove box door that goes on the glove box that was added at some point later, which looks cool though. And then just the different pieces and like the bow shelf that go under the bow where you can put life jackets and things. So that those parts had been found with epoxy on them and some varnish, and I took it down and decided to take them down all the way because the varnish had failed completely or hadn't been done a lot of, and the epoxy, I just needed to put it back to the way it looks. So I took it down to the wood, meaning plywood, and then some pieces are lumber, and then brought them back up with stain, and then 3 coats of TotalBoat High Performance Expoxy, and I'm going to show you how that worked out for me. I just completed the staining of the interior parts. This is the second seat back. This is the shelf that goes on the bow, and then the parts for the shifter and the glove box door. I used the Old Salem cherry gel stain, and I sanded this. The seat back especially worried me because it's cedar, and it was a lot softer, obviously, than the mahogany and the oak. So, you know, with the oak, I try to sand it rougher so it'll take more stain, which will be darker because it doesn't want to stain dark very much. And with this, I went up to 220 and sanded it, trying to give it less grain so it would take less stain, being lighter and match the boat. So it looks pretty good from preliminary comparisons that I made. So I'm going to let these parts, this will be the last of the interior other than some of the floor pieces for the gas tank and the battery, which will be painted gray. I'll let these sit for 24 hours, and the plan is to use TotalBoat's surfacing epoxy, which is used for boat sealing the stain on boats to give it more protection, and then also 3 coats of that equal sometimes up to 7 coats of varnish. So like the rest of the interior, this had epoxy on it, but it was so beat up that I took it right down to the cedar itself so that we could restain it and then build it back up with epoxy. And then I'll put a couple coats of the Pettit's high build varnish on it as well to give it some varnish shine, but also even a little bit of protection between the varnish and the epoxy so that the epoxy won't get broken and have some of the problems that we had before. So that's the plan. Let these dry, and then I will, when I do the epoxy on these, it'll be the same day I do the epoxy on the inside of the boat for the inner keel and the keelsons, which are going to get re-epoxied because of the same reason. They were beat up. I took them down to lumber, got them fair again, went ahead and put cherry stain on, and now I'll just make that all one big project in one day with the coating epoxy from TotalBoat. So another step done. I'm ready to put the epoxy coating on my parts that go in the boat, and then I'll put them also on the inner stringer, keelsons, inner keel, and I'm using TotalBoat's High Performance Expoxy. I'm using the slow hardener because I want more open time, maybe than some others. But because it's my first time, I want to make sure I have a good amount of time to play with it. It's about 3 hours before it tacks up so I can put the next coat on. So it's really more than probably I needed, but I think, you know, as a beginner, I wanted to make sure I had lots of time. So I do, these are calibrated. So all you have to do is one pump for one pump. And what I have is the, this is the bow shelf of the boat. Goes up under the deck a little bit, not much, but I want to coat it. It had epoxy on it originally, and I'm going back and putting epoxy back on everything that did, because it really preserved it. So with the first coat of 3 I'm going to put on, I get my brush wet. I'm using a brush, and I treat it kind of like sealer over stain. You want to be able to push it into the grain. Even though this is very smooth plywood, it still has a lot of grain that I want to fill. And what this epoxy is doing is taking the place of varnish and sealer in the way that it's building the coats faster. So from what Dan Lee on Dan Lee Boat Building's YouTube channel, which I've been watching, and he's doing that on new construction. So, you know, some people will say, well, that's new construction. Well, this is in a sense the same thing. I've got wood that I've taken down to its basic level, and I've put stain on it. But I'm also working with some really good wood, and I don't feel at all compromised in putting this epoxy on this wood, especially because I saw it work already. Whoever did this boat years ago did the same thing. So I'm going to go with, in this case, the original look that I found, and I'm going to tip this off when I get it all in the grain. I've already done several of the little parts that I wanted to play with and experiment, make sure I had it right. One of the things Dan Lee mentioned in his videos is that when he first did it, I think he was in a hurry, from what I could tell. He was trying to do a full varnish job on a runabout deck in 3 days, from start to finish. And I think what Dan did is he did not allow himself time for the stain to firm up and dry. You know, what happened with Dan is he had, the stain got muddy. It started to float to the surface of this epoxy. Here I'm just going to keep pushing it back and forth into the grain. Eventually I'll tip it. So Dan ended up, while it was still wet, he ended up wiping it down without any sort of thinners. He wiped that first coat of epoxy with a rag and was able to maintain his stain on the wood. Whatever stain was in the wood stayed in the wood. And then the stain that floated out to the surface of the epoxy, that came off with the rag. And what he ended up finding out is he had left a thin layer of the epoxy over the stain, which then reacted to the wood and then got hard, and he was fine. And then he followed up with the second coat you roll and tip, and the third coat you roll and tip, and then you sand, and then you go ahead and, you know, start the process where he did put a sealer on, and then just 3 coats of varnish and he was done of the high build. He was using epiphanes. I'm using Pettit, but I really don't see much difference. I think his epiphanes had more of an epoxy composition to it, so that probably gave him really quick results. He was also spraying it, and I'm, you know, using a brush, mechanical. So he was able to do it quicker with the brush or the sprayer. Short of the stain issue he had, the rest of it went smooth as silk, and he was able to do a start to finish job of his, at least his surface finishes in 3 days. So that was quite impressive. I don't have a spray gun. I'm not in that big of a hurry. So I'm just gonna do a traditional brush. I did yesterday's experiment to see if I had stain floats or the stain floats to the top. It did not. So that told me that probably Dan in his experiment had not put or let the stain dry. I let this dry a full 24 hours as recommended by the gel stain manufacturer, which was, if you remember, I'm using Old Salem gel. Dan was using Spirit stain. So again, that might have had something to do with it. So we're not doing experiment to experiment that's equal. His was different in some ways, but basically the same concept. So I'm gonna go for it and just see what happens here. This is more, the first piece of plywood I used was the shifter. That was made out of plywood, and I did it on the back. So if anything went wrong, I wouldn't have any way have to be ashamed of what happened, because it is technically on the inside of the of that shifter, so no one will ever see it anyways. I wanted to see what happened. I wanted to see if any stain would run and float. It didn't. And then that gave me confidence that I could do today's bigger bow shelf plywood panel, also with the same stain, same day, and then have a lot more confidence that it was going to be fine. So, and I'm also going to work in my shop quietly so I don't create any dust, and watch this very closely. If it gets muddy, I will do the same thing Dan Lee did, is go ahead and put a rag to it and get it cleaned up. So I have that all done now. I have this all applied. I'm going to just tip it now, which we do with varnish and other things. Because I consider this a finish, I'm going to tip it just like I do varnish with a brush. I've got all of the grain filled as much as I can with this application. And now the brush mechanically hits the bubbles that are created when the epoxy goes into the wood. It replaces that air, and then the air comes out. And epoxy has a tendency to have air in it when you mix it, even though I did it very carefully. It's going to have some in it. And this tipping literally pops those bubbles, which is what I want. And I'm going to look for dry spots and drips, make sure I get those. Yeah, like anything, epoxy, the more you can clean it up now, the better. Saves you sanding, and you won't have as much work. Just let the epoxy do the work. It's covering up all of the areas well. And I'll do the bottom last. So most of the time I'll do bottoms first, because then it sits on a surface or on usual tripod stands. You know, it won't leave a mark if you're very careful, but I usually try to do the top last. So last night's experiment showed that this takes about 3 hours between coats. So now I'll let this sit and then go ahead and do, I have to do the seat back, which is a little more complicated because there's a lot of different pieces. So I'm gonna have to spend a lot more time on that. But I'm gonna sit this to the side, and I'm gonna just let that dry. And after the third application, you let it dry overnight, and then you hit it with a sander. Dan wasn't specific, but I'll probably start with 220, because you're just trying to knock the top off and get it flat like varnish, and then I'll put my sealer on and then follow up with my varnish and have a beautiful looking piece. So back to work. Well, that completes the rest of the parts. This is the seat back, if you remember. One that I didn't point out in all my screw holes. And sometimes you'll find even a void. I can see one here. Just a tiny little, maybe a little where a screw came through the original construction. I'll just kind of flood that with my artist brush. That way you're getting epoxy to fill that gap that, you know, varnish will have to do eventually if you don't, and the epoxy will be a better solution to that. So kind of I'll flood it and then feather it out. And then with the screw holes, this is where the hinges that attach it to the second bench seat. I also flooded those and took my artist brush and went down inside just to keep it nice and flooded. There's enough indentation there that I know that my screw can find that pilot hole, because that's something you worry about getting exactly right. But there's enough epoxy in there now, it's flooded, but also I know I've got a little indentation on the top that I can use it to find my screw direction and go ahead. So what I'll do is I'll kind of watch this, look for bubbles, look for some muddiness. I don't think I'm going to see it, but I'm just going to keep an eye on it over the next few hours and then go ahead and, you know, flip this one over. I don't want to, it'd be hard to put this thing upside down on end without maybe having some issues. So I'm just going to let it lie, and then I'll flip it tomorrow when I do the back side. I'll do 1, 2, 3 again, which I did with these other little parts. I just did that. The bottom of this, I'm not going to stain, but I will, you know, put epoxy on it too to seal it. Because the whole idea is to encapsulate the piece of wood completely. And that's why I'm very, very careful to cover everything. I think that's why you have the 3 coats. That allows you to, if you missed anything, it's going to find it on the second or third time. And like I said, the second time I go through these parts is going to be with a roller, because the grain is filled in. I can see this very well on the cedar. And then I'll tip it. And then on the third, you'll roll and tip again and then let it dry overnight. So I'm going to let those dry out. It's 3 hours later, and the test to make sure that it's ready for the second application with the roller and then tip is that it feels like cellophane tape when you touch it. So you can just barely feel it if I didn't have gloves on. But that's for me about 3 hours. It looks like in my 60-degree barn, and when I put it on, I've got about 3 hours, and I can start all over. So I did the little parts, and I just have enough resin. I did 4 pumps, so I have enough. And you just put, because it's now flat, because you did all your hard work with the, you know, the brush and working into the grain, it really has flattened out. So now I just have to go back through and roll it on with a short nap foam roller, And you use foam because you don't want it to disintegrate. That's what, most of them are foam, but you can get some long nap ones. Like when I use paint, I'll use those. But this one I can use a short nap, and I just want to put the epoxy on, and then I tip it. So getting the bubbles out. And they popped pretty good on the last one, so I'm really happy with how this is working out. You want to start a little farther off your wet edge and then go back into the wet edge and get this all nice and sticky. And then I just try to, like paint or varnish, I move it from wettest to now drying edge. Just trying to get that so it's smooth, but I'm also pulling out the bubbles on the second pass, where I'm just dragging the brush across to get the bubbles, because you're just pulling the bubbles away from the surface. They don't need much encouragement, you just pull them off. So I'm going to keep doing that and finish this up, and then I've also been working on the inner part of the boat. I've got the I guess the inner keel and the keelsons on either side. Those were epoxy originally. I stripped them, and then because they were all beat up, and then I restained them, and now I'm going to do the 3 coats of epoxy on them, also against the edge where you see the gray. I'm putting a lot of extra epoxy into there, almost like a fillet, so that these are resealed, so that's all waterproof, like it was when I found it. It was pretty good when I found it. I'm giving it even more of a encouragement to last, and then I'll put varnish on those as well when I do the 2 or 3 coats of varnish on the sides, in the dash, and the seats. It's also going to be on these 3 longitudinal members, so that'll be nice and tough for the next so many years. And then the gray paint will go in there and really finish that up. So back to work, and I will check back in on coat number 3. Here we are the day after the 3 coats of epoxy marathon. This is the second bench seat back. I still have to do the back. That'll be something I can do tomorrow. This is the bow shelf, I call it, underneath the bow. Everything came out really flat. I don't know how many coats of varnish that might equal, but it's a lot. In fact, I did the dashboard with stain, sealer, and varnish, and the glove box lid, I did that in epoxy. I'm going to kind of do an experiment, see how many layers of varnish it really does take of the petted high build to get something close to that, and then I'll know. One thing I did discover is that I was working, it took about an hour to do the parts, and then an hour to do the first coat of the interior, which, was the inner keel and then the keelsons on port and starboard. Then the second coat was like 15 minutes. The first coat really does such a good job of filling the grain if you go vertical and horizontal just to get it into the grain, that the second and third coats go very fast. And I found this to be really looking good, and it's back to where it was when I found it, and it'll be very durable. I'll put as many coats of varnish on those 3 parts as I am the interior, and we'll have a really nice looking interior. The varnish will probably wear off quicker with those. That's a given, because it's where the foot traffic is. But I think it'll also give the owner an idea that things are getting worn down, and then she'll know to go in there and do varnish renewal versus, with me, epoxy renewal. So I think it's going to be a good telltale for her to have that. So the next step is for me to do the back of this, and I'm going to stain into the back of the bow shelf as well. So it'll be complete. When you take it out, it'll look nice. So that's the plan. With the third coat of epoxy dried overnight, I'm now using my orbital sander on with 180 grit. I started with 220 and it wasn't cutting enough and I didn't want to press onto it, so I went to 180 and it's doing beautifully. I've done a few pieces already. What I'm looking to do is flatten it as much as I can without getting in to the stain. So I want to get down really close into this white haze grayish thing, which is the epoxy, and coming in probably just about on coat 1, and then you'll start to see these low spots. So I'll keep going and going and get very close, and then I'll finish this up with a 3M Scotch-Brite pad to get the low areas, and then the rest of it is filled in with varnish. So it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be really close. And so many coats of varnish have been avoided now, and the envelope I've created around this piece is complete. From the holes to the edges to the surfaces are all encapsulated in clear epoxy. So I'm going to keep going on that, and then I'll hit it with the Scotch-Brite, which, like the edges, I'll do that with Scotch-Brite because I don't want to. The paper is really going to cut in easily into those edges, and then corners I use the Scotch-Brite just to get the shine off. All of the pieces have been washed. I wipe them down with water and a little bit of soap to get the blush off that is left. It's a chemical residue that's left on top of the epoxy, which helps it harden. It's like a surface that allows it to finish. Wash that off, and then now I sand, and then I'll do the Scotch-Brite on the edges, and then start building up the varnish coats, which with the Pettit's high build varnish, probably about 3 is all I'll put on. That will conclude today's episode on the epoxy application to the interior parts. The next episode will show me applying the sealer over the epoxy and then building up the Pettit high build varnish, which returns the gleam back to the boat parts and to match the interior. If you're enjoying the playlist and the video series, please hit the subscribe button so that you're alerted. I put the videos out every 2 weeks on Wednesday mornings. If you're enjoying it to the point where you'd like to give positive feedback, it's always nice. I like to receive that. And if you have questions, of course, please please post those in the comments below, and I will answer them the best I can. And till the next episode, take care, and we'll see you then.